So welcome everybody to the Act Now on Factory Farm Reform Indiana virtual legislative session. My name is Jenny Jenkins. I'm the Senior Special Projects Coordinator at Hoosier Environmental Council, and we are really pleased that everybody's here. Today's event is sponsored not only by Hoosier Environmental Council, but by some really great local organizations that are doing a lot of good for Hoosiers, animals, and the environment in our state. So we'd like to extend a special thank you to the Humane Society of the United States, Indiana, Earth Charter, Indiana, Sierra Club Hoosier Chapter, the Indiana Farmers Union, Socially Responsible Agricultural Project, and last but not least, Citizens Action Coalition. So I'd encourage you to check out all these great organizations and see all the good that they're doing for our state. We have a lot to cover within the hour, so let's get right into it. We have three very knowledgeable speakers today, and our first speaker will be Kim Ferraro from the Hoosier Environmental Council. Kim is HEC's Senior Staff Attorney and Director of Agricultural Policy. Kim came to HEC 10 years ago from the Legal Environmental Aid Foundation, which is also known as LEAF, where she served as the Executive Director. Kim has been practicing law for over a decade, helping communities fight factory farms. Kim is also joined today by two great speakers, State Representative Sue Errington, who represents House District 34, which is focused on Muncie and Delaware County. In addition, we'll hear from State Representative Tom Saunders, who represents House District 54, which covers parts of Henry, Rush, and Wayne counties. I'll hand it over to Kim, and she'll give you a little more bio on or background on those two before they speak. Kim?
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for spending your lunch hour with us today. This is what we're going to cover. I'm going to kick us off with a little discussion of background of the factory farm problem in Indiana, and specifically with respect to current regulations and laws. We're going to cover a couple of bills of concern that are pending in the Indiana State House, one in particular that is going to be heard in committee on Monday. So we're going to need all of you to take some action today and over the weekend. I'll then be turning it over to Representative Sue Errington, who co-sponsored some proactive legislation that would restore property rights for citizens who are impacted by large confined feeding operations. And then she'll discuss what that bill does and how it does what it does. And then we'll have Representative Saunders talk a little bit about the challenges that we face in passing proactive legislation with the supermajority controlled Republican caucus, some of their views, and how we need to take a look at the long game to making some good policy change in Indiana. And then, of course, we'll open it up to questions and answers. Speaking of questions and answers, if you do have some as we go throughout the presentation, please type them in the chat box. Jenny and I will try to monitor those, and then we'll cover them when we get to Q&A. All right, so let's just do a little background. Probably everyone who's attending already knows what a factory farm is, but you might not. This is what they look like on the inside, and just about 95% of all the meat, poultry, and dairy products in the United States come from livestock raised under conditions like this, where they're crammed and caged by the thousands into confinement buildings that look nothing like traditional farms. The treatment of farm animals is one of the world's biggest animal welfare issue, and it's getting bigger. Right now, more than 70 billion farm animals worldwide are slaughtered for food each year, 10 billion in the US alone, and the vast majority of them live in conditions like this where they can't move around freely or live naturally. And of course, these 10 billion animals produce a lot of waste. Livestock in the United States generate an estimated 335 million tons of waste annually, which is 40 times the amount of human waste leaving our sewage treatment plants. Indiana is no different in this respect. Our livestock generate as much urine and feces as that produced by 87 million people, or 14 times the human population of Indiana. Unfortunately, unlike human animal waste, livestock animal waste, or most animal waste, is allowed under current regulation to be stored in unlined earthen lagoons and pits, like you see here, where there's nothing to keep the contaminants in the waste from leaching into groundwater or spilling over into nearby waterways. And of course, when those pits and waste lagoons get full, they have to dispose of the waste somewhere, and so they spray it or spread it untreated on surrounding land. There are roughly 2,000 concentrated animal feeding operations and confined feeding operations. The acronym is CAFOs and CFOs in Indiana. This map shows their location. What this map doesn't show is that each of these facilities is growing dramatically larger in size. To give you an example, just over the past decade, we went from the average size hog CAFO of 5,000 hogs to now the average hog CAFO having over 10,000 hogs. So each of these locations is becoming more and more harmful to people who live nearby and the surrounding environment. Based on item data, we know that the leading source of water contamination in Indiana is E. coli, which indicates that animal waste is present. We also know that there are serious threats to air quality and public health due to the tremendous amount of waste generated at factory farms, and as the waste decomposes, it releases dangerous gases, including hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, particulate matter, endotoxin, and other harmful emissions that are released into the surrounding area where people live. That's done in a few ways. You can see in these pictures through these big, huge ventilation fans that are on the side of most hog CAFOs that pulls the decomposing waste gases from the pits that are underneath the buildings and blows them out into the ambient air around, because if you allow those gases to accumulate in the facility, it would kill the hogs. These emissions are off-gassed from the open air lagoons, and then of course when the waste is spread on fields, the particulates and emissions can go into surrounding neighborhoods. There are unfortunately major gaps in federal and state regulation of CAFOs that leave public health and the environment unprotected. A perfect example, or the most worrisome example, is that there are no regulations at all at the federal and state level of a CAFO's air emissions. In Indiana, our confined feeding law only requires a 400-foot setback from homes, 300-foot setback from waterways, and only 100 feet from schools, churches, and parks. And CAFOs are also allowed to be built in floodplains and other environmentally sensitive areas. Indiana also has 2 right to farm laws, which gives the industry a right to harm. Under these laws, CAFOs enjoy essentially absolute legal immunity from liability for the harm that they cause to surrounding neighbors who were there first. And as a result, neighbors are then stripped of their property rights and ability to obtain a remedy in court. And as I'll talk about in a minute, there's a bill in the legislature that aims to make this even harder for folks to protect their property rights. Another problem that we face that I know Representative Saunders will touch on is the long history of defeating and fighting against bad bills that would take us even further backwards, and the huge difficulty that we're having trying to pass proactive common sense legislation. We do face huge obstacles at the State House, and so we're going to have to think about this problem not only during an active legislative session, but what we can do off session. So Representative Saunders will certainly talk to us all about that. So let's get down to some bills of concern. Excuse me. The most urgent one that I want to bring to everyone's attention is Senate Bill 411. It's entitled Environmental Nuisance Actions. Its authors are Senators John Ford and Scott Baldwin. It's been assigned to Senate Environmental Affairs, which is chaired by Senator Mesmer. And this bill is set for hearing in committee this coming Monday at 10 o'clock a.m. But let me tell you what this bill does. In combination with existing laws, including the Right to Farm Act, which I mentioned a minute ago, and another law called the Forestry and Logging Rights Act. So these are already existing laws. This bill would eliminate all available court remedies that enforce personal and private property rights from infringement by not only agricultural operations, but all industrial operations and forestry operations as well, as long as these facilities are compliant with environmental regulations. So let's break that down so that everyone understands what's wrong with that. Because you might say, well, gee, you know, if these facilities are compliant with environmental regulations, then what's the problem? Aren't people being protected? Well, the answer to that is no, because first problem is environmental regulations, their purpose and intent is to protect the public's interest in environmental and our natural resources, protecting air quality and water quality, resources that are not owned by any one person. They're in the public trust. So environmental regulations are not aimed at protecting private interests. Excuse me. And these causes of action for damages are retrospective in nature. So they come into play when damage has already occurred and give property owners, landowners, and people some ability to get a remedy in court when environmental regulations don't do their job to protect us. So that's the first problem. So the second is, we also know that environmental regulations often don't go far enough even to protect the public interest. And a good example of that is the case of confined feeding operations, where we have literally no air emission regulations. So, which is the number one complaint we understand that IDEM gets from people with respect to CAFOs. Current regulations address minimally manure management and protecting water quality, but again, no environmental, no air emission regulations. So that means under 411, a CAFO with 10,000 hogs can move right next door to where somebody lives, emit huge amounts of ammonia and hydrogen sulfide that causes their property values to plummet and make living in their homes completely untenable and unlivable. We know of many cases where folks in this situation have had to move, have had to leave their own homes that they've lived in for decades. So in this situation, the CAFO would be compliant with regulations, but the people who are damaged would have no ability to protect their property rights in court. So they not only would be unprotected, they would have no recourse for the harm. The other problem with 411 is that it would, like I said, not only apply to agricultural operations, but to industries at large. So, landfills, refineries, smelters, logging operations, any sort of extracting or polluting facility that, as long as it's compliant with a permit, it can essentially act negligently and unreasonably and cause harm with impunity, with absolutely no accountability to the folks that get harmed. A good example of this would be the documentary Dark Waters, which folks may have watched over the summer. And this is the story of DuPont that poisoned the water of a small town with its Teflon chemicals, which EPA didn't even know about. And so the facility was unregulated. This was a chemical that was unregulated, that was killing people and causing cancer. So if the only reason that DuPont was held accountable was because a nearby farmer found that all of his cows were dying, and so he suspected DuPont was the cause. He sued in negligence and trespass against DuPont and held them accountable and exposed what was going on. If Senate Bill 411 were the law, in that case, that farmer would have been prohibited from bringing those sorts of, from bringing his lawsuit. So we have an urgent call to action on Senate Bill 411. It, like I said, is coming up for a committee hearing on Monday at 10 a.m. in Senate Environmental Affairs. So, and I'm going to show in the next slide who the committee members are. So if you are a constituent of any of these committee members, please contact them and urge them to vote no. And even if you are not in the district, if you're not a constituent of the committee members, if you have time, it certainly would be helpful for you to reach out and urge these members to vote no and express your concerns. Specifically ask Senator Mesmer, who's the chair of the committee, not to hear 411. And if you're in Senator John Ford's district, who's the author of the bill, please urge him not to proceed with 411 on Monday. So how do you do that? If you're not familiar with the Indiana General Assembly website, it's iga.in.gov, and you click on committees, link down into environmental affairs. It'll bring you to this page. And on the left, you'll see who all the committee members are. You can click on their names and it'll take you to their caucus page and their contact information. So that's the quickest way to reach out to these members. I would also suggest calling their phone numbers available for their legislative assistant, that in addition to an email, you leave a phone message or talk to the LA. I want to cover two more dangerous measures that are bad from a policy perspective, but we're not as concerned about them because we don't think they're going to move this session, but you still should be aware of them. And if you're in contact with your lawmakers, you could mention them to oppose these two measures. One is Senate Joint Resolution 14. It's the constitutional right to farm and ranch. Those are the authors, Senator Dorio, Mesmer, and Tomes. It's been assigned to Rules and Legislative Procedure, which is where we think it'll die, thankfully. But it's super concerning. We saw this same measure a few years ago, and what it would do is it would amend the Indiana's state constitution to create a fundamental right to use, I think the language is effective farming and ranching technologies. So in essence, giving a fundamental right to operate a CAFO. And what's wrong with that? Well, our fundamental rights that are enshrined in the Constitution would be our right to vote, our right to free speech, our freedom of religion. These are our inalienable rights that are deserving of to be in the Constitution in the first place, and also are very difficult to regulate, as they should be. So if you put a right to farm and ranch in the Constitution, it would make it extremely difficult to regulate CAFOs. The other concerning bill is House Bill 1573. The title of that is Agricultural and Forestry Activity. And what it would do is it would strip local governments of their ability to regulate outside the buffer of their municipalities. So most cities and towns have some jurisdiction outside of their borders to prevent impactful development to protect their citizens within their borders. And so this bill would strip that ability. Again, we don't believe this is going to move, but we've seen measures like this in the past. So we always have to be on guard and watch for them, and certainly do weigh in with your own legislator to oppose both of these bills if you have the opportunity to meet or talk with them. I just went over the calls to action, but again, urge your own state lawmakers to vote no on both of those. If you really want to go further than that, you can contact the committee chairs, Bray and Zent, on both of those where they've been assigned, and ask them not to hear it. And then if you're in the bill authors districts, you can certainly reach them and ask them not to proceed. If you're not sure how to find your legislator, again, go to the Indiana General Assembly website, and you'll see a link that says find your legislator. It'll bring you to this page. You can type in your address and it'll bring up who your legislators are and their contact information. So now I'm going to turn it over to Representative Errington to talk about House Bill 1472. It's entitled Right to Farm. And it's a good bill that she authored, co-sponsored with Representative Saunders. And it would actually remove the Right to Farm Act's special legal protection for negligently located, designed, or operated CAFOs and would restore the property rights of neighbors. So Sue, on to you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to participate today. A little bit, first of all, about how I got interested in this issue. I learned from Kim and others from HEC about a court case from a couple of years ago that dealt with the Right to Farm Act, which originally, the original Right to Farm Acts were passed back in the 80s. Indiana's was 1981. And their purpose was to protect farmers from nuisance suits from people who were moving out into the country. And once they got there, they didn't like the smell. So the farmers were there first. And so it made sense to give them some protections. But in 2005, I believe it was, Indiana strengthened our Right to Farm Act, which really made it really difficult for neighbors who had already been there before, say, a CAFO moved in. And the case that I learned about was the Hemsel case, which it was in 2019. And it was a situation where two older couples who had lived there for years, the Hensels were third generation on their farmland. And the neighboring farm had been in cropland, but it changed. And it changed to an 8,000 hog farm, which drastically changed, the air, everything about the neighbor's property. And it became so bad that Mrs. Hemsel had to leave her home and I guess go into town to live because it was really affecting her health. The Hensels, and you might say, well, why don't they just sell and move away? However, these same conditions that are harmful to health also can decrease the value of your property, and that's what happened to them. I mean, often it's, property values go down by half. So when I heard about this case, and actually, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was determined in the appellate court that they not only didn't have, standing on negligence or nuisance, but also the other leg of this type of litigation, and that was trespass. So any way that they could argue their case or anyone else after that decision, they were all blocked from all the types of remedies that they could pursue. And that just doesn't seem right. It seems like you ought to be able to, if you're being harmed, to be able to present your case so that the court of law could decide whether you were or not. So that's the background for the bill that I introduced, and that Representative Saunders is my co-author. And our our goal was to balance, the playing field so that it didn't take away some of the rights that are in for farm, that were in the Right to Farm bill, but it added a balance for the neighbors. And so, Kim, if you would go to the next slide. This is language from the bill. And the part that's the old language is in regular type. The bold is what's the new language in the bill. So it's dealing with negligence, and it lays out what types of things would be affected. And notice it says, if the operation failed to use reasonable care. I mean, that's the standard, is reasonable care for the way the operation is managed. So next slide, please. So if you look on line 19, again, new language, the older language is referring to, this is sort of findings. And so what's added is, while also protecting the quality of life, land values, and property rights of citizens in established rural communities. So we're not talking about somebody that moves next door to a CAFO. We're talking about people who were already there. And the other large chunk there that says the General Assembly also finds that agricultural operations in rural communities may change in size or type to become confined feeding operations or concentrated animal feeding operations, which may cause surrounding landowners to be subject to extreme nuisances that diminish property values and interfere with the ability of landowners to continue using and enjoying their property. And again, you see there at the bottom, we're talking about the rights of established landowners. Make sure that their rights are considered and protected when agricultural operations make changes to the size and type of the agricultural operation. Next slide, please. So again, the bold language, the conversion, and here we're talking about a change in type of agriculture. So long as the conversion is reasonable under the circumstances, will not be injurious to the use and enjoyment of other property in the vicinity of the locality for the purposes already permitted, and will not substantially diminish and impair property values within the vicinity of the locality. So there's different, the second part that's in bold is repeating that for another thing that the court would consider. So Kim has already told you that the EPA and IDEM does not have air quality regulations that would deal with this. So that's another issue that should be remedied, but this is what we're presented with. So this is the heart and the meat of the bill that Representative Saunders and I have proposed. And next slide. So
we're gonna go to Representative Saunders in a minute, but and I don't want to interfere if you're not finished yet, Representative Errington. But I did want to make, let me go back. I did want to make a few clarifications about how the Right to Farm Act works here and why this language is so critical. This significant change provision has been held by the courts to bar existing residences from obtaining any damages when an agricultural operation, which includes a farm field, vacant farm field, and a CAFO. So a conversion from one type of ag operation to another, i.e. a farm field to a CAFO under existing law, isn't considered a significant change that would remove the right to Farm Act's protection. That's what's kind of wonky about existing law and circular and crazy. So courts have said that, you know, the farming operation exists because it was vacant land before the neighbors got there 30 years ago. And that's how they've managed to make this coming to the nuisance, you know, intended coming to the nuisance law into one that strips people of their existing property rights. And so what Representatives Errington and Saunders have done here is they've said, okay, you can change, but if your change isn't reasonable, if you put a 10,000 head hog CAFO next to established residences and you cause them harm, the Right to Farm Act isn't going to protect you. All right, so I want to pivot to Representative Saunders because, and no offense to you being a Republican, but I had to use the elephant in the room slide here because, you know, we are faced with significant roadblocks. We've faced it for at least a decade since I've been involved in this issue in trying to pass common sense legislation, like, for example, giving IDEM the authority it needs to regulate air emissions. We know on 1472, which is an extremely reasonable bill, as Representative Errington has talked about, it literally just protects landowner rights, people who are there first, who have a right to not be harmed, to be able to live in their homes comfortably. That's all that would do. Yet Representative Leahy, who chairs House Ag, has said there's no need for the bill and he's not going to give it a hearing. You know, essentially it's dead. So what do we do, Representative Saunders? What is our long game here? What do citizens need to be doing? What do we all need to do in order to pass common sense legislation to convince your caucus to be like you?
Hello, can you hear me? I don't.
Yeah, and let me here, I'm going to get rid of my screen so people can see you. There we go.
Well, good morning. I guess it's good afternoon, isn't it? Well, thanks for having me on today. And I just wanted to say how I got involved in the process. I live in a small rural community, a town of 400 people. We're surrounded by ag. We didn't have a problem until about 20 years ago. They've always had livestock around us, but then we had a gentleman move in and build a dairy farm a quarter of a mile from our city limits. And so we've experienced everything they've talked about, the odor of the flies, when they clean out the pits and they put it in large semi trucks and they bring it through town. And I live on a state highway, corner US 40 and 103. And as they turn that corner, all their waste would spill out over the side of the truck and up the road, and people going to the post office and the drugstore and the bank, either drive through or walk through it. And they call their legislator, and I try to get involved, and this has pitted families against families and neighbors against neighbors, and it's really not been a comfortable situation. I was accosted in the bank one time. The banker apologized to me after the guy verbally abused me for 20 minutes. But so that's how I got involved, and it's never too late. I was trying to think a couple of years ago when we had a representative who had a piece of legislation that would, because excuse me, people were going to work for CAFOs and taking pictures and posting them online, which made the facilities look bad, and the farmers didn't care for that. So we had a legislator that who happened to own a CAFO, who was going to make it against the law, and you could be fined and in prison for that. And that bill passed all the way through until the final moments of the legislature, and we were able to kill that on the final night. So it's never too late. But what you're up against is Farm Bureau is one of the largest. You know, there's what they considered 5 big lobbying groups in the State House: the Farm Bureau, the Chamber of Commerce, Manufacturers Association, the Realtors, and I forget who the other one is. But so we're fighting them. They have paid people in the hall all the time. But the advantage you guys have that they don't is you can vote for or against these legislators, and it's very important that you contact them. I saw a while ago somebody asked if it was a Senate bill or House bill, how you knew that. Senate bills all start with 100, 102, 204. House bills start with thousands, so 1004, 1000, 1200. So that's how you tell if it's a House bill or a Senate bill difference. But you need to contact your legislators. Not only do you have Farm Bureau, which is a very strong lobbying organization, then our members, we're citizen legislators. We all have other occupations outside the legislature. We have a large group of farmers who serve in the legislature. And most of those farmers have CAFO operations. And Representative Leahy, who's the chairman of Ag, is a CAFO operator. Senator Lysing, who is she's on Ag. She's my senator. She's on Ag. Is she the chair? I think she might even be the chairman of Ag in the Senate. She had a CAFO operation at one time. So I always say we're in their pockets. I mean, the one representative, and he and I went to head on an issue. If a lobbyist hadn't stepped between he and I one day, I honestly think he had decked me. And I told him, I said, I realize I'm in your pocket, but you have to realize what the public my neighbors are concerned about, their property values, their quality of life. So you have the power. Kim and the other people that represent you out there do a good job, but they need your assistance. Unfortunately, it's not easy to get to us, but if it's like me, you run into these people in the grocery store or at the bank or at a local restaurant, and it's not unreasonable for you to walk up to them and nicely and tell them what your concerns are and ask them to consider voting or not voting the way you want a bill passed. And this shouldn't be a political issue, but for some reason it seems to be. I mean, Sue and I are opposite parties. Our counties adjoin. Before I live in Wayne County. I live in Henry County. I used to share Henry County with a person from Wayne County in the old maps. He was Democrat. I was Republican. He and I were able to pass legislation on CAFO issues out of the House, but then when it got to the Senate, they would get killed over there on the Republican domain. So the elephant picture might have been appropriate, Kim, unfortunately. So, but, and even if they're not your party, they still represent you. So you need to call them. They have emails. And even though we're kind of in a lockdown situation in State House, if time allows, you're still welcome to come out there and testify for or against the piece of legislation. It's a little harder now, but we still like to hear from the public. And you do have really the power. It just takes a lot of you to get together.
Representative Saunders, could you speak a little bit about some of the ways that folks could stay connected and meet with their lawmakers short of the grocery store off session? I know there are different ways, and that would be great. And to the extent that you think they're effective, if you could speak to that. And then also, if you've got any thoughts about particular lawmakers within your caucus that you think could be persuaded if they heard from their constituents enough. And maybe you might be uncomfortable calling folks out, but if you're not, I think that would be really helpful.
Well, one of the things I think might be a problem is most people enjoy their bacon and their milk, so they don't want to do anything to stifle the availability of that. But a lot of people who live in the city, let's say the Carmels of the world, when they talk about stifling farms, they don't really understand what a CAFO operation is. And so we also need to educate them on the issues. I know Farm Bureau has taken and had been bringing the city folks to the country, but when they do, they take them to one of the nicely run facilities, and it's been cleaned up for the day, and the fans have been running, and so there's not the odor, there's not the flies. They've emptied the pit. You know, the concern I keep trying to tell them is, you know, when they're draining these pits, they hook what I call fire hoses to the pond, which is 2 miles away. They run those fire hoses in the side ditches and through the culverts, and then they take it to a field 2 miles away and drag it behind a tractor. And so I have concerns about them contaminating side ditches, which leads into the creeks and the streams. So, but everything we do is online, so you're able to watch. You're able to watch all of our committee meetings and our votes online. As I say, there's emails. If a lot of times we get a postcard, and we might get a postcard from 100 people, but it says the same thing. So really, I'm still old school, handwritten. If you can send them a handwritten note, or you all probably received questionnaires from legislators with maybe 5 or 6 questions on them. At the bottom of the questionnaire, there's a space for you to write a note. In my particular case, anybody that writes a note to me, I get that separate from the one that they just check the A, B, or C on the questionnaire, and then that's compiled, and they give us a percentage of how the voters feel. You can come to the State House and stand outside and ask to see a legislator. You can come to 336, hand in a note. It's not as easy this year as it's been in the past. I still say a telephone call. You probably won't get to talk to the rep unless you have their home phone number. I still have a landline, and that's the only reason I have a landline, is so you guys can call and tell me what your feelings are. Because other than most of the phone calls I get now, they're trying to sell me supplement insurance for Medicaid. But so.
Do you think, I know that there are town hall meetings, for example, the League of Women Voters does legislative town halls throughout the year. I know they certainly do it during session, but are there things like that people should be looking out for off session? I mean, I guess the point I'm trying to get at is everybody gets real active in the legislative process during session, but to tackle this problem, it seems to me that we've got to grow the movement and continue talking to lawmakers off session, that we've got to get them educated before, you know, everything starts going really fast during the legislative session. So I do want to open this up. So we've got 15 minutes left to some questions that are coming in, but if you could just briefly talk about that, that would be great.
In an ordinary year, we all have third houses or cracker barrels, whatever you call them, depending on where you're at, where we come in, we give them an update of what's been going on, and then we take questions. And that's a good opportunity for you to meet your local legislators. In some cases, there's 4 or 5 there at the same time, because we're having a district. And sometimes those are sponsored by Farm Bureau. Sometimes it's the League of Women Voters. Sometimes it's the Chamber, IU East in my particular case. So that's a good opportunity for you to do it also. And this, this legislation, Sue started working on this legislation during the summer. So like you say, everybody gets involved during January and March, but it's never too late to do it all year long.
Okay, great. Jenny, I see that there are tons of questions that have come in. Are there some that were asked earlier that you'd like for any of the panelists that you see have not been answered by our discussion?
Actually, we have a lot of comments, really, more than questions, but I will scroll through the last final ones. I think we've gotten to most of them, and I did ask everyone to repost in the chat if we somehow missed yours, and I apologize if I did. Let's see. Yeah, I think these are mostly comments, Kim.
Okay. Well, then let me, I'll post some questions in. And first, I want to share some big news. We've heard that Senate Bill 411, the really bad bill, isn't going to be heard on Monday.
See how powerful you are.
Well, let's hope so. I've had some conversations with Senator Ford, and all of us on the team have been doing some work this morning. So hopefully, but that I would hesitate to tell people not to do the call to action. I feel like we still need to keep up pressure on that bill, because it's not, they could still hear it next week, if not Monday, another day. So
I saw, if you don't, I saw somebody had a question down here about wind turbines. There's House Bill 1381, which is authored by Representative Soliday, which is going to take away all local control for siting and setbacks and all that for wind turbines. So what we just told you about the Senate bill, you could do the same thing for 381.
are you trying to hijack our legislative forum here, Representative?
Every opportunity, you never.
We have had some questions come in as soon as I said that. So one is, how do we educate ATC and legislators about the dangers that industrial? Oh, I'm sorry, that's the wind turbine one. I apologize. Let me move to the next one. Is it effective or annoying to lawmakers to call day after day about the same bill? Great question. I've had that.
You mean the same person calling about the same bill?
I assume so, yes.
Well, it certainly showed that it was top of the mind for that person. But, you know, it's our legislative assistants that answer those phone calls.
Yeah.
So unless they're calling you at home, it's probably not going to be annoying to the legislator. It may be to the legislative assistant.
I actually have a question for either one of you. Probably Representative Saunders, this might be a good one for you. You mentioned that folks in your caucus are concerned about, you know, protecting bacon and where meat and poultry come from is sort of one of the talking points that they maybe go to for why legislation that we're proposing shouldn't go anywhere. Could you give us, and so I have all sorts of things I could say about that, but the question is, can you give us an idea of some other sort of ideologies or reasons that folks in your caucus would be resistant to protecting people's property rights? What are some of the other you know, views that you've heard that we can then think about how we could address their concerns?
Well, I still think it's education. This comes to my mind. A couple of years ago, when Airbnbs were a big thing, we went to caucus, and the representatives from the Carmel and the Fishers area were concerned about uncontrolled B&Bs in their neighborhood and all the strange cars that be on the street and all this. And I got up and I said, you're concerned about an extra car on the street, but I can't get you concerned about what my neighbors are facing when they're pumping raw sewage onto their lots, and the smell and the odors and the property value. So it's still about education. And we've got a lot of people that have never been in a CAFO. They don't get to the country. I brought Representative Delaney, who lives downtown Indianapolis. This was when Phil Flum was in the legislature. He kept talking about, we kept talking. He said, I want to come and see one of those. Can I bring my bicycle and ride? And I go, well, not on our county roads, you can't. But we brought him out and changed his mind about it. And he realized why there needed to be setbacks and why we were concerned about odor. And it's just, I don't know if it's ideology as much as it is uneducated in some cases.
Well, I guess an example I could give, when we had, you'll probably remember this, the bill that you and Representative Errington wrote a few years ago that would give IDEM the authority it needs to regulate air emissions. That was 1494. And we got a committee hearing on that in Representative Wilkins at the time, his chaired committee. And it was standing room only with people who have suffered, as we've talked about, coming in and, you know, telling their stories. We had experts in, you know, property valuation, in air modeling, and, you know, I mean, really just an incredible presentation of the facts. I mean, I don't think that we could have presented a better case for why IDEM needed, you know, greater regulation, and yet, you know, the bill didn't pass. And so I guess what I'm getting at is what might resonate? Like, I think of protecting property values as something that might resonate, but what are some other things that you think might be compelling?
You correct me if I'm wrong, but the picture you had of the committee up as we started was Wilkins's environmental meeting.
Yes,
And if
it
you look
was.
around the table at the number of, I mean, Representative Leahy was there, Bo Baird was there. Most of that committee is made up of farmers. So we were off to a wrong start right there because they protect their own livelihood. And see that all that standing room only, but that didn't get to the entire body. So that was just that small group of people. We've got to educate. We've got to educate.
Well, one of the attendees says, why not give them tours in an open bus by driving by the CAFOs?
Well, you know, the Chamber of Commerce, I don't think they've done it recently, but they used to have during the summer a tour of things that they wanted you to learn about. I know the wind farm over on the west side of the state when it was new and building. We went there. We also went to a US Steel facility in Lake County. And they did, I know I went on 2 or 3 of these tours. They were always very educational. So maybe that's something that ATC might want to consider.
Okay. Well, we're wanting to certainly empower people on our call to do things that they can do. Here's a question for either one of you. Thinking about what kind of communication is most likely to get to you, does your LA tell you about every call? And what is the lag time for emails to be processed, and do they actually reach you?
Yes, they reach me. And sometimes it's probably it might be a day or so before they reach me. And they report the calls to me. So, and I personally think those are effective ways if you're telling your own story, particularly, that I feel those are effective ways to contact legislators. And you know, that personal touch, another thing I remember from a few years ago was when the marriage amendment was being debated and it was on its last year and had to get through. And I know that the Indiana Equality, may have had a different name at that point, had a really grassroots effort. I mean, they put quite a bit of money into, I think probably every legislative district. And I can remember Kevin Mahan, who has at the time had part of Delaware County. He also had Blackford County, telling about a neighbor who came over and knocked on his door, asking him to oppose that. And he was amazed. He said, I had no idea my neighbor felt that way. So you might be surprised at, what impact you could have, particularly if you know one of these legislators.
Great.
Well, I get my emails, I get the phone messages. They may be a couple of days left. And my people tell me I get the most handwritten letters at the State House. And I don't know if that's because I've got an older constituency out there, but and I've had people at my door and if you get online, I think it sometimes gives you a mailing address, and some of them have their home addresses on there. If you drop them a note at home, and not a 3 or 4 page letter, but a 1-page something or other, and you send it to their house, they're going to see it there, or the wife's going to make sure they see it, or vice versa. And like Sue, people are not bashful about coming up to me. And I was mowing my yard one day and stepped back and stepped on a guy's foot. And he goes, can I talk to you just a minute? So, and that's, I don't have a problem with that.
What I hear you saying is that the personal connection is best, that certainly sending an email or signing on to an organizational letter, that's all well and good, but it's really your constituents reaching out to you personally with their personal concerns is the most compelling for each of you anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, we're almost out of time. So I did want to address one comment and one question that came up in the chat box. One was earlier on, it was a great suggestion about how everyone who is attending today also really needs to educate themselves about all of these issues so that they can educate lawmakers and others about this. And I think that's absolutely right. It really isn't enough to just say CAFOs are bad or I don't like them. And I'm not suggesting that any of our anyone on this call does that. But the point is you've got to really know what you're talking about. And so I did want to point everyone to HEC's website. We have a factory farm solution page that details, has policy sheets, our policy papers, fact sheets, just about everything you need to know about the impacts of CAFOs, from antibiotic resistance to climate change to animal welfare issues. It's all there. So any aspect of this issue that you really care about, it's a good starting point to do research and get up to speed. So the second comment I wanted to, or question that I wanted to raise before we close, question from one of the attendees is, are there any ethical concerns that should be addressed about the conflict of interest when CAFO owners push such legislation? And I think this question is getting at what, I think it was you, Sue, that mentioned, or maybe it was Tom. Anyway, I'm not giving credit to who said this, but that, for example, Representative Leahy owns a CAFO, and that there are legislators who are voting on these things that own CAFOs. Are there ethical rules at the State House that would prohibit that? Is this something that we ought to be pushing for?
Well, I'm on the House Ethics Committee, and the Senate has an ethics committee as well. And our rules are not, they're sort of general. But basically, if this would affect you personally and maybe not other people, and there's also the issue of public perception. So when the Rules Committee gets a complaint, we look at it, and one of the problems, I guess you could say is a problem, is the fact that we're part-time legislators. So most people have another job. I know sometimes teachers will ask, do I have a conflict if I vote on this bill that deals with education, or particularly teacher salaries? And the fact that they're not unique, it's not just them, it's all teachers that would have an interest in that bill, that our ethics rules say that that's not unethical to vote on something like that.
Yeah, we have to fill out a conflict of interest statement each year, and what agencies we would be working with if we had any, and if we've had contact. And there's a good and a bad thing about a citizen legislature, and they put you on committees that you supposedly have some expertise in. I mean, before the legislature, I was a county official, the county assessor, the dreaded tax man. And so if I have any expertise, it was in the assessing field. So I've been on local government for 25 years, as long as I've been there, and I've been on roads and transportation. And so you want to put people that have knowledge on committees that are helpful. But on the other hand, and it's perception. I had a conversation with the legislator this week that filed a bill that I thought he had some perception issues over, but
we're 2 minutes over the one o'clock hour. So I did want to, if Sue and Tom, or Representative Saunders and Errington, if you can stay for a few minutes, great, we can continue this discussion. But for folks who need to go, I did want to mention February 13th is Indiana Civic Day. HEC's executive director will be speaking at that at 11:30 a.m. February 18th is the Sustainable Energy Forum at 6:30 p.m. And it'll be broadcast from HEC's Facebook page and will feature 2 lawmakers and 2 energy policy experts. And then February 25th is HEC's mid-session legislative report at 6:30 p.m. All of these events are on our website at hecweb.org/events. If any of that is interesting to you. I want to thank everyone who spent their hour with us. I'm happy to continue this conversation for a little bit for folks who want to stay for a few minutes. But otherwise, we'll say goodbye to those who need to leave. Okay, well, looks like we still have a few. Okay, well, I did want to, there was an earnest question on here that I wanted to pose to you both. And it is, how much does it take for constituents' concerns to outweigh the lobbyists' money? This is an honest question here because I'm not sure what fight to fight at this point. I don't know if Lori Ecker is still on, but this is your question, hopefully. Hopefully she's still here.
Well, that's a good question.
She is still here.
I think you can look at the campaign finance reports. They're public. They're under the Secretary of State's website under elections. And you can see who donates to who. And maybe that will help you understand what some of the influences are on legislators. That's not to say that someone is bought because they got a contribution from a certain organization or a certain individual, but it does give you an idea of access, I guess is what I would say, is that if you hand somebody a check, you're probably going to be talking to them. And even though a legislator may not say, yeah, I'll do this. And this is something I struggle with, is if I take campaign contributions, does this maybe subtly bias me in what my thinking is? So I think we all, as legislators, have to watch out to make sure that we aren't being influenced by the money.
I agree. I go and you've got in an ordinary year, you have the lobbyists in the halls, and you know who the good lobbyists are, and who a good lobbyist will tell you both sides of the issue, educate you, and then leave it up to you to make a decision. Early in my legislative career, I took a vote and I got a note sent in to me, and I came outside and the guy said, "You need to remember where your money comes from." And I said, "Well, you know what?" I said, "I need to remember, I got to look at that guy in the mirror in the morning." And I couldn't if I'd have voted that way. And I said, "I can't give you back what you've given me, but I never want another dime from your organization." Unfortunately, the whole system runs on campaign contributions. It's reportable. I mean, you just, as Sue said, everything, we're supposed to report anything over $100. And if we get $1,000 contribution during a campaign season, we have to report that within 24 hours. I try to report every contribution I get. I'm pretty proud that I was supported by local small contributions. So, but I still think you hear the stories of your constituents, whether it's you live next door to a CAFO or your family was wiped out because there was too heavy of a truck on a highway that couldn't stop, and we want to increase the weights on trucks now. And so, you gotta. We heard that bill in committee the other day, and oddly, a former state rep from up north who was on your caucus too, but I thought a lot of, unfortunately, her grandson was killed on a highway under those situations. So those kind of stories, I mean, they weigh on my mind, and I'm sure they weigh on other members also.
Well, all right. I definitely know you two are busy people, and folks have other things to do today.
I'm quarantined.
Well, We still want you to be able to enjoy your Friday. So, thank you. Thanks, Representative Saunders. Thanks, Representative Errington, for all your wonderful work and caring so much about people in your districts and about this super important issue. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for giving us an hour today.
Thank you.
Lots of thanks from the audience as well, about the representatives. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.